Hey everybody, I'm Jeremiah Kimmelman, Jeremiah K on Twitter and GitHub, and I'm with my illustrious co-host here, J_Jaden on Twitter, Jason Denizak in MeetSpace. And so welcome to the first episode of CivicCast. It's basically a forum for us to kind of meet with people who are leading some awesome thoughts around the space of civic engagement and civic hacking and bringing technology to government to make cities better for the people who live in them. So today we have our first guests, two awesome Brits. We have Matt Sheret and Francis Berriman. Why don't you two go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Hello. Are we live now? How exciting. Okay. I'm Francis. I used to work for GDS. I recently joined Code for America. I was front-end lead at GDS, and now I am doing designery type things and front-end things for Code for America.
I'm Matt Sheret. I am at GDS. I'm in the creative team there, which for me is mostly posters and PowerPoint, and occasionally stuff like the design principles, which I guess we're going to talk a bit about.
Yeah, and for those who are uninitiated kind of in the lingo of the civic space, GDS is the government digital service in the UK. Maybe could you explain a little bit about what that does, just for people who aren't 100% aware?
You can go ahead. I'm writing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so GDS is a little organisation inside the Cabinet Office, which is a ministerial department in the UK that sits right at the centre of government, and its function is to basically make government work better, and we do that digitally. And we do that by building tools and services and helping different departments in the way that they manage IT procurement and service procurement and all the rest of it. Probably the biggest thing that we're known for is gov.uk, which is the UK government's official website. It's the best place to find services and information if you're going to do anything with government. From massive transactions like paying car tax, right the way through to finding out what's just been published on flooding or updates to little pieces of guidance around God, what did we move the other day? We moved the massive UK border agency, what used to be the UK border agency, all of their content moved over to gov.uk. So that's all of the information that you need if you're going to apply to visit the UK, get a visa or anything like that. That's now something that you do through the gov.uk website.
That's awesome. That sounds like, to someone who is a student of the American government, sounds like an immense task. How did you even start with the idea of GDS and moving it on digital, and how did that lead into crafting the design principles?
So GDS kind of started sort of like a secret project in this dingy, horrible office south of the river in London, which isn't far. And we did the secret project where we built an alpha of a website in 10 weeks, and that was used to kind of prove the point that you could make something quickly in an iterative style, and it can be good. And then with that, we got the blessing to do a lot more. And we eventually managed to move to nicer offices. Not much nicer, but nicer. And part of that, so in those original days, we had these index cards on the wall, which were sort of things we thought were important. There were sort of fairly silly things like Buckeye 6 was one of them. But also things like be open, be iterative, be... I think some other ones. Do you remember those cards?
No, because this is way before my time.
There were maybe 15 of them, perhaps. And we decided they were kind of helping to make us make decisions. So they were sort of forming the way that we thought about things and how we'd like other people to think about things. So we ended up formalizing them to the design principles, which ended up being the 10 that many people are quite familiar with now, I hope.
Sorry.
No, carry on.
No, just as random context, I'd been aware of the work of GDS for a while just because I knew a bunch of friends who were there, and a bunch of people I respected from my pocket of the internet had gone to work there. And when the design principles came out, I was at my then job just sort of going, they're sort of doing it right. It's just weird. Like, government shouldn't sort of be writing things like this. This doesn't feel like a place that you necessarily believe government starts from. And that was absolutely fascinating, and I started thinking seriously about whether it would be somewhere I could work, and then very shortly afterwards became somewhere I was working.
I don't know if you know this, but originally the design principles were not the design principles. A chap called Tom kind of heads up a lot of the GDS work. He wanted us to actually make a pattern library, a bit like the BBC Gel, if you've ever seen that. And we were pretty stubborn about that. We were like, well, we can't make a gel, we can't do a pattern library because we haven't made enough. So we felt it was more important to sort of codify the ideas rather than the doings, because we hadn't done the doings yet, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So then you did alpha dot.
It almost didn't happen. This is what, Yeah.
Right. And then you did it with alpha.gov.uk. That was kind of the first instantiation.
That's the first one. That was the 10-week project that was not in any way complete. It was just like a stab in the dark, really, to see what it might feel like to do something like that. And felt completely different to the current one you'll be familiar with. The beta we built over, I can't think how long it was now, about 8 or 9 months. And that went out in July of 2013 or June 2013, and then live October 2013.
The design principles, the alpha of those were published, I guess, halfway through the development cycle for the beta, roughly.
Wait, do I mean 2013? I mean 2012, don't I?
You mean 2012?
2012.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
It all blends together.
It's been that long.
So you'd actually, what's interesting about the design principles for me is that they were published after a period of doing.
Yes.
So there was a lot of stuff that you'd made and stuff that you had, hammered out, worked out what was important, and then gone, okay, we believe that these things are the most important things we can put at the centre of the things we build from this point onwards, from the experience we've had today.
And they were defining everyone who was involved. Like, didn't matter what they were. If they were a content person or a engineer, these things were defining how they were doing their job. So they felt important.
Yeah. So with that, so what are some of the design principles? And maybe we can post a link in the show notes for people to actually walk through all of them. But maybe if you could help us understand how the doing actually directly informed one or a few of those design principles.
What's your favourite ones?
Well, the first one is probably the most important one.
Yeah.
Start with needs.
And then we have a little asterisk that says user needs, not government needs, because we've all worked at places where the stakeholder is essentially the boss.
Right.
Which was something we were trying to fight against quite strongly. We didn't want the boss to be the Prime Minister or a department head. The boss had to be citizens,
Yeah. It's also the needs of a user of a service are a very specific way of defining a relationship that a person will have of government. So a citizen and a user are slightly different concepts. Are different enough that the user need has to be the core principle, because you can understand how you can meet that. Now, a person's needs are actually a lot vaguer. They might require I want to make sure that it's fluffy language all the time and I'm comforted and coddled along the process, while other people just want it to be as remote and distinct as possible. But that's a person's needs. What a user needs is, I need to get this application completed in order to do X, Y, and Z. And you can build against those defined goals much more easily than you can many of the other more fluid things like stakeholder needs or government needs or whatever. There are lots of other things coming alongside that. We don't forget, of course, that a government is often also a user of a service. Their needs are important in the process, but the foundation principle has to be the user's needs.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good working example. Yeah, I mean that's why we spent so long, for example, rewriting all of the content on GovUK, because the language before was not consistent or confusing or wordy or 101 terrible things, really. Whereas now it's much more kind of direct, but professional's not the right word. I kind of want
informative, maybe. I mean,
it's
come on, word man.
Well, I mean, part of it is just plain English. You're using language to open up the mechanisms of what's taking place. You wouldn't need to have legal assistance to understand what they're being told, unless there are huge legal implications to the thing where it's beneficial for them to talk through it with a lawyer. In which case, the first thing you should tell them is you should be looking at this with a lawyer or a legal representative. That barriers shouldn't be language-based. It should be as open as possible.
And similarly, that kind of led on to one of the other principles, which was do less. Our UI for GovUK ended up being extremely austere, I suppose, because the bells and whistles that many other websites have are just getting in the way of people getting things done with their needs, really. So that was a super conscious choice we made.
Sarah Richards, the head of the content design team, has this phrase that if a user notices our writing, then we've failed. That any point at which the design or the content or any aspect of the website becomes an interference, then we are stopping that person getting the thing done that they want to get done.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So you had these principles that you said were kind of informed by the process as you were building product. But one of the things that you also did is you talked a lot about them externally. Is that right? You had the blog. You had various presentations that you were talking about externally. How did that kind of work in kind of as a feedback? Or go ahead.
On principle, everything we did was open anyway. Everything was published. Everything was on GitHub. Everything we wrote about everything. I think in a sort of slightly obsessive way. Like we wanted to be very open. And I have to say, we didn't know they would be as well received as they have been. So the talking about them more kind of came out of that, I think. We were just releasing them for fun, really. Like, oh, they're really useful for us. Maybe they'll be useful for somebody else. And then suddenly everyone was like, no, these are how we should do everything. Like, we did something right. That's great. So then we ended up talking about them quite a lot, I think, as a result of that. I don't think it was an intent to end up talking about them a lot. But they have been extremely useful just to sort of like set the tone with new people, new departments, new groups we work with. If they receive them well, we kind of know we're on the right track, I think.
Yeah. There are also, it's a list of 10 principles that you would be hard pushed in a lot of organisations to really go, okay, no, this isn't for us. That it's pretty much common sense. Some of the examples and some of the phrases that are called out are things that have been part of development culture, particularly in San Francisco, for a long time. But they felt revolutionary because they were coming from government, and that they were becoming enshrined in an organisation in the heart of government that was building digital stuff. And so I think that's why it's part of why it's got so much attention. That people were just, I guess, surprised, perpetually surprised.
Well, that's kind of a cool segue, because in the pre-show we were talking about how they're kind of undergoing a little bit of a change right now. So you built these principles from building the alpha and kind of understanding what actually would make good services, good digital services, and then you said that it's kind of, you have to be hard pressed not to use them. But so how are you changing them then, and why change them?
Yeah, so there are some that are just I think they've become clearer over time what their value was. I'm gonna just like flick through and find a proper example of that. So there was one that was in there called that was listed as understand context, and I think at the time people meant a lot of that principle was around research. It was about understanding that there are lots of mechanisms to access a service that may be digital, maybe non-digital, and that people are going to be experiencing in a variety of different ways. But when you actually get down into what that meant on a practical level, lots of that principle could be distributed among other things. That you should be doing enough user research to understand the needs up front. So the context is part of that. As a user, I need to be able to do X, Y, and Z on these devices because I'll probably be using it in this kind of space. Like it's covered in different places. So then you have this space that's opened up that just sort of goes, well, what else is important to the way that we're working at the moment, and what else should we be telling people? So Principle 7, when the beta is released, is going to be...
This is exclusive.
Yeah, I guess this is an exclusive. Well, I don't know. We're still being wrangled at the moment, so anything that I say here is totally subject to change. We didn't have anything about multidisciplinary teams, and looking back over the last 2 years, that was that was some good traffic.
Yeah, sorry.
We didn't have a thing in there about multidisciplinary teams, and they are like critical to getting stuff done. And if you don't have a mixture of policy people and developers and designers and writers and a whole heap of experts with different specialist skills, you're not going to be able to get the things done that you need to get done. And they have to be empowered as well. So number 7 is going to be something like the unit of delivery is the team, that there needs to be a group of people empowered in place at the heart of the thing that's being built in order to make the service as good as it can be.
I'm quite excited about that.
Yeah.
Some things really much easier.
Yeah. And then there are a couple of other things where, some of it's about changing the examples that we're calling on and making them more specific. Some of it's about changing the phrasing. So start with needs, for example. Partly because it had an asterisk at the end, like there were a couple of our own content rules that we were breaking with that thing. So we're just changing it to user needs, not government needs, because it's a clearer statement of what is meant by that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But the importance of, you iterate this stuff in the same way that you iterate a service, because if you don't, then you're not learning from the process of making things. We were saying before recording that that iteration is critical, so that the principles themselves shouldn't be stagnant in the same way that the services shouldn't be stagnant. We're on an internet now that can continually change and develop, relatively cheaply. And if you don't make use of that, then you're fundamentally ignoring one of the best and most important features of it as a service. So you just need to find different ways of making that work for the organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by service design, and especially in the context of government? Francis, you had a slide deck from your time at Government Digital Services where you said build digital services, not websites. And governments traditionally, I think, have definitely approached technology as just a thing, or as a website, or as an app. How does that affect your philosophy, and how does it affect your working relationships with other agencies in government?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we slightly abuse the term service design a little bit. It's not the traditional one people go to school to learn to do, I think. But I think when we've been saying service design, we sort of mean the digital aspect of someone's encounter with government may not be the only part of that. It's quite often that one lasting power of attorney, for example, is a transaction which is, I think, recently beta level. It's one of the furthest along transactions they've done at DDS. And that's it's one part of a process someone is going through, probably quite a hard process, where they're having to hand over control of their funds to a family member or someone they trust when they're possibly losing their own faculties. And the part where they're filling out a form online is such a tiny part of that entire service. There'll be other touch points where they have to speak to maybe a lawyer, an accountant, or they have to visit, I'm trying to think of examples, like the solicitor and such.
Yeah.
The part when they're filling out the form is a tiny bit of the entire process of them handing over essentially the keys to their life to another human being. And we've tried to be sensitive to that when we're designing our services, so that we know that they may not begin with us and they may not end with us. They're doing a much longer process with government and people around them.
LPA is a fascinating example for a bunch of reasons. One, it's not just GDS working on it. The Office of the Public Guardian, who are part of the Ministry of Justice in the UK, the team is there maintaining and running that service now. It's in public beta. It's had tens of thousands of applications coming through it, and it is a successful service that is being built on and iterated on. It's hugely emotive. One of my sort of weird bits of backstory pre-GDS is that my family were going through one of those just before I started. I actually watched how difficult it was for them to come to any kind of satisfactory conclusion, because you at the time had to get a lot of legal professionals involved. There were small industries built around telling people what the legal implications of these documents were, and there was room for it to be written in a much clearer, simpler language that people could just complete at their own pace and in their own time when they're emotionally ready for it.
Yeah. So now that a part that was annoyingly technically difficult is now much easier. So that removes a whole source of pain for a group of people. Even though at the edges there's still very painful things to do. So that's sort of a slightly sad example, but that's the kind of thing we have to think about. Most people's interactions with government are not simply just passing a form along.
Right.
A lot more.
I mean, it's sad, but it's an extremely important kind of transaction that occurs between people and the government and their family members. So.
Yeah.
So we're basically out of time. We kind of want to keep it under 20 minutes so people frankly, don't get bored of Jason and I talking. So thank you so much for the inaugural episode of CivicCast, for the exclusive on some unveiling of future design principles.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-oh.
Totes that. Totes that.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah,
We'll cut it out. We'll cut it out in the post-production. Great. So thank you so much, and see you all at the next episode.
All right, and as always, you can follow us on GitHub at github.com/CivicCast, on Twitter at CivicCast, and on the websites. We still have one of those, www.civiccast.us. All right, this is Jason out.
Thanks.